I never expected to be treated like a trespasser in my own home. Yet, as I stood on my porch, arms crossed, staring at the smug HOA officer demanding my ID, I realized he had no idea who he was dealing with. His self-satisfied smirk told me he thought he had all the power, that he could dictate who was allowed in and out of my house. The arrogance in his stance, the way he leaned ever so slightly forward, as if expecting me to cower and comply, was almost amusing. If only he knew that the man he was challenging wasn't just another homeowner. I wasn't just some powerless resident, bending to the whims of their ridiculous rules. No, I was the new chief of police. And this was about to be the worst mistake of his life. It started a week earlier when I officially moved into the neighborhood. The house was a dream, spacious, secluded enough for peace, yet close enough to the city to stay connected. I had no intention of dealing with HOA nonsense, especially since I knew their reputation for unnecessary power trips. Within days, I had already noticed the overbearing presence of their so-called compliance officers, patrolling the streets like they were running some private security force. The first warning came in the form of a letter taped to my door, not mailed, not slipped under, but aggressively taped as if they wanted to make a statement. It was a notice about unregistered residency, claiming I hadn't formally presented myself to the HOA board. That was my first red flag. I had purchased the home legally, filed all necessary paperwork, and yet, these people thought they had the right to approve whether I could live in my own house. I ignored it. I had no patience for petty power games. But the second encounter made it clear they weren't going to let this go. Stepping outside one morning, I was greeted by two men in HOA uniforms standing at the end of my driveway. One of them, a lanky man with dark sunglasses and an air of self-importance, called out to me. His voice was dripping with authority that didn't belong to him. "Sir, before you proceed any further, we need to verify your identity." That was when I knew this wasn't just standard HOA meddling. This was a full-blown harassment campaign. They were testing me, seeing how much I would tolerate before bending to their authority. I didn't respond. I simply stared, watching their confidence waver under the silence. They expected resistance, maybe even outrage. What they didn't expect was a man trained to handle power-hungry individuals like them every single day. I turned and walked back inside, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. But that was only the beginning. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. Notices continued to pile up, each more ridiculous than the last. Failure to comply with HOA registration procedures. Violation of community standards. Unauthorized presence on property. Unauthorized presence? In my own house. It was almost laughable. Almost. Until the night someone tried to enter my property. It was around 11 p.m. when I heard the faintest rustling outside. My instincts kicked in immediately. Years in law enforcement had trained me to notice the smallest disturbances, and this was no stray animal or passing breeze. I moved quickly but quietly, reaching for my phone to check the security cameras. What I saw made my blood boil. Two figures stood at my front gate. One of them was HOA officer Sunglasses, the man who had demanded my ID earlier. The other? A burly guy with a clipboard, as if this was some kind of official visit. They were talking in hushed voices, but their intentions were clear. They were trying to find a way inside. I had seen enough. Without hesitation, I grabbed my badge, slid my holster into place, and made my way to the door. The second I stepped onto the porch, the motion light snapped on, bathing them in a harsh white glow. They froze. Caught. I could see the realization creeping into their expressions, the slow realization that they had seriously messed up. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence drag out. Then, in the calmest voice I could muster, I said, "Care to explain why you're trespassing on my property?" They didn't answer immediately. Instead, HOA officer Sunglasses straightened his stance, feigning confidence. "We had reports of an unidentified occupant in this residence," he said. "It's HOA policy to verify all residents in the community. You failed to comply." I couldn't help but laugh. Failed to comply? I repeated. That's interesting. Because from where I'm standing, you two are the ones violating multiple trespassing laws. Burly clipboard guy shifted uncomfortably, his grip tightening on his clipboard. He glanced at his partner, clearly hoping for a response. HOA officer Sunglasses didn't back down. Instead, he took a bold step forward, eyes narrowing. "Sir, I'll need to see some identification before this escalates any further." That was the moment I decided I was done playing their games. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my wallet. But instead of handing over a driver's license, I flipped open my police badge. The badge that clearly read, Chief of Police. The look on their faces? Priceless. The moment I revealed my badge, a visible shift occurred in their demeanor. The once smug expressions twisted into something between panic and forced composure, their postures stiffening as if trying to reassess the situation without outright conceding defeat. I let the silence linger, watching as they scrambled internally for an escape from the hole they had just dug themselves into. HOA officer Sunglasses, his confidence flickering, attempted to recover by clearing his throat, his hand twitching near the clipboard he no longer seemed so eager to use. The other one, the burly man, swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the street as if contemplating a swift exit. But I wasn't about to let them off that easily. These two had gone too far, and I intended to make it clear that their fabricated authority meant nothing when stacked against real law enforcement. They had stepped onto my property under the illusion that their rules overpowered state law, believing their self-appointed titles gave them the right to demand identification from a lawful homeowner. It was laughable, really, but the implications of their actions ran deeper than just some power-hungry HOA board overstepping boundaries. This was harassment, a deliberate effort to intimidate and control a resident they deemed noncompliant. Their entire operation relied on fear, on homeowners too exhausted to fight back, on threats disguised as regulations, on manufactured penalties that few dared to challenge. But I wasn't just anyone. I had spent my career confronting individuals who thrived on exploitation, those who manipulated laws for their own gain, and I knew exactly how to handle people like them. I took a deliberate step forward, ensuring my presence alone made them uncomfortable. They had spent their careers bullying, but they weren't prepared to face someone immune to their tactics. I could almost see the gears turning in HOA officer Sunglasses' mind as he struggled to find a way to assert control over a situation that had already slipped beyond his grasp. He attempted to maintain his authority, forcing a stiff smile as he gestured toward the clipboard. He muttered something about standard procedures, about ensuring security within the community, but his voice lacked the confidence he had earlier. His words were flimsy, unraveling under the weight of my silence. The burly man remained tense, eyes flickering between his partner and me, likely waiting for a cue to retreat. I let them squirm for a moment longer before finally speaking, my tone steady but firm. This wasn't a request for explanations or excuses, this was a warning. I made it clear that stepping onto private property without permission wasn't just an overreach of HOA authority, it was criminal trespassing. I stated, in no uncertain terms, that if either of them returned uninvited, they would be facing more than a complaint at their next board meeting. The weight of those words settled between us, thick and undeniable, and I knew they understood the consequences. They had been exposed for what they were, pretenders, desperate to maintain control in a place where they held none. The panic in their eyes confirmed as much, but I wasn't done yet. With the efficiency of someone who had handled countless similar situations, I reached for my phone and began scrolling through my security footage. Every visit, every unauthorized attempt to enforce their fabricated laws had been recorded, stored, and timestamped. The trespassing, the bogus notices, the fabricated citations, it was all there, undeniable and damning. I turned the screen toward them, watching as their faces paled in real time. Any last remnants of bravado evaporated, replaced by the unmistakable realization that they had made a grave miscalculation. It was one thing to push their luck against residents unfamiliar with legal boundaries, but attempting to strong-arm the chief of police? That was an entirely different level of stupidity. For the first time since the encounter began, HOA officer Sunglasses faltered completely. He stammered something about a misunderstanding, about how they were simply following board instructions. But the excuse was weak, and he knew it. I didn't need to say anything else. My silence alone was a verdict they understood all too well. The burly man, sensing the inevitable, nudged his partner, an unspoken agreement passing between them. Without another word, they turned on their heels, moving quickly, their once confident strides reduced to something bordering on retreat. But as they hurried down the driveway, I knew this wasn't over. People like them didn't just walk away, not when their authority had been publicly challenged. This was only the beginning of their retaliation, and I was more than ready for it. I had seen it before, the desperate attempts to reassert control, the underhanded tactics designed to remind everyone who really held power. They weren't just going to back down. No, they were going to escalate. They would take this as a personal attack, an insult that required retribution. And I was counting on it. Over the next few days, the tension in the neighborhood thickened. The usual patrols from HOA compliance officers increased, their vehicles passing by my house with a frequency that was anything but coincidental. Notices continued appearing, each more ludicrous than the last. Warnings about non-existent landscaping violations, fines for fabricated noise complaints, even an absurd citation for an unauthorized vehicle parked in my driveway. It was a pathetic attempt at intimidation, and if they thought they could wear me down with paperwork, they had gravely underestimated my patience. But then, something happened that confirmed what I had suspected all along. A new letter arrived, not a standard HOA notice, but something official-looking, printed on formal stationery with a legal tone. It was a summons from the HOA board, demanding my presence at a disciplinary hearing regarding multiple violations. The accusations were laughable, an absurd collection of fabricated infractions designed to paint me as a menace to the community. But the real message wasn't in the charges, it was in the timing. They were making their move, attempting to assert dominance in the only way they knew how. This wasn't about rules or regulations. It was personal. I read the document twice, feeling a slow, amused smile pull at my lips. This was their plan. A pathetic tribunal where they played judge, jury, and executioner? They thought dragging me into a kangaroo court would somehow force me to submit, that a panel of self-important board members wielding meaningless power could intimidate me into compliance. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. They had no idea that by summoning me, they had just given me the perfect opportunity to turn the tables. The summons was nothing more than a thinly veiled power play, a desperate attempt to reassert control after their authority had been publicly shattered. They had no real legal standing, no actual ability to enforce anything beyond trivial fines and empty threats, but they were clinging to the illusion of power with everything they had. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, held in the so-called HOA Community Center, a glorified clubhouse where they gathered to dictate meaningless rules to residents too exhausted to fight back. The letter was filled with formal jargon, phrases designed to sound official, words like disciplinary action, failure to comply, and potential consequences. It was laughable, really, a performance meant to intimidate, but to me, it was an invitation. They wanted a confrontation, and I was more than willing to give them one. The days leading up to the hearing were eerily quiet. The usual petty notices still appeared on my door, but the in-person confrontations had ceased. The HOA officers no longer lurked around my driveway, no sudden visits, no aggressive demands for identification. It was as if they were preparing for something bigger, something they believed would finally put an end to their problem, me. I could feel the shift, the way neighbors avoided eye contact when I passed, the whispering that stopped the moment I got too close. It was clear they had been told a version of events where I was the villain, an unruly resident refusing to follow community standards. It was an old tactic, a method used by those in power to isolate their targets, to make them appear like the unreasonable ones. But I had dealt with far worse. These people were playing checkers while I was preparing for chess. The night before the hearing, I meticulously gathered everything I needed. Every notice they had ever sent, every recorded instance of harassment, every video of their officers overstepping their authority. My security footage alone was damning enough, but the legal precedents I had researched would ensure they had no argument to stand on. If they thought this would be a trial where they sat in judgment over me, they were about to receive a very harsh reality check. I wasn't just walking into that meeting to defend myself. I was going in to dismantle their entire operation. The following evening, I arrived at the community center precisely on time, dressed in uniform. It was a calculated move. If they wanted to play the authority card, I would remind them exactly who the real authority was. The moment I stepped inside, all conversation ceased. The board members, seated behind a long table at the front of the room, stiffened at the sight of me. The rest of the attendees, a mix of homeowners and a few familiar faces from the neighborhood, sat in rows of folding chairs, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. It was clear that for many of them, This was the most interesting thing to happen in months. The board president, a man in his late 50s with thinning hair and the self-importance of someone who had never faced real authority, cleared his throat and motioned for me to take a seat at the center of the room. The entire setup was designed to be intimidating. The elevated table where they sat, the singular chair positioned like a defendant on trial. They wanted me to feel like I was the one under scrutiny, but the energy in the room was shifting. The attendees had expected a nervous homeowner, someone flustered, someone unsure of themselves. Instead, they got the chief of police, standing calmly, exuding the kind of confidence that only came from years of real authority. The board president launched into a speech, his voice attempting to carry weight, but it was clear he was flustered. He recited a list of violations, each more absurd than the last, including my refusal to properly register with the HOA, my failure to comply with community security procedures, and my aggressive confrontation with board officers. The words hung in the air, meant to carry judgment, but I could see the uncertainty creeping into his expression as I remained utterly unimpressed. When he finally finished, he leaned back, smug, as if expecting me to plead my case, to defend myself like some guilty party hoping for leniency. Instead, I calmly reached into my bag and placed a thick folder on the table. The quiet rustle of paper was deafening in the otherwise silent room. Then I began. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. With measured precision, I laid out the evidence, piece by piece. I spoke about their illegal trespassing, about their baseless citations, about the harassment that went beyond mere policy enforcement and crossed into targeted intimidation. I referenced state laws they had blatantly violated, city regulations that overrode their so-called authority, and legal consequences they had either been ignorant of or arrogantly dismissed. I presented security footage of their officers attempting to access my property, of their unauthorized patrols stopping residents without cause. The tension in the room thickened with every revelation, the shift in power becoming undeniable. The board members, once so confident in their ability to control the narrative, were now visibly uncomfortable. But I wasn't done. With deliberate movements, I reached into my bag once more and produced a second folder, one containing official complaints I had filed against the HOA with both the city and state authorities. Their eyes widened as they realized what this meant. This wasn't just a resident pushing back. This was the law stepping in, a force they had no power over. The weight of their own arrogance crashed down on them in real time. The president stammered something about this being an internal matter, about how I should have handled it through proper channels, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew they had lost. And then came the final blow. I informed them that due to the numerous legal infractions committed by their officers, several of their board members were now under investigation for harassment and abuse of power. The gasps from the audience were immediate. Whispers erupted as the reality of the situation settled in. The board had spent years operating under the assumption that their control was absolute, that no one would dare challenge them. But their reign was over. They had picked the wrong person to intimidate. The silence stretched, thick with humiliation, as I calmly gathered my things. The board president, his face drained of color, sat frozen, unable to form a coherent response. Without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving behind a room full of stunned faces and the crumbling remnants of their manufactured authority. This battle was over, and I had won. The fallout was immediate and far more chaotic than I had anticipated. By the time I returned home, word had already spread across the neighborhood like wildfire. The once feared HOA board had been publicly humiliated, their authority dismantled in front of an audience that had long suffered under their rule. The whispers turned into murmurs, the murmurs into full conversations. Homeowners who had spent years silently complying with absurd rules were now emboldened, questioning every fine, every restriction, every ridiculous demand that had once seemed unchallengeable. It was the kind of disruption the HOA had never encountered before, one that threatened their very foundation. I knew they wouldn't take it lightly. People like them never did. The first sign of retaliation came less than 24 hours later. It wasn't subtle. A bold, red-inked notice was taped to my door, this time in the center, stuck with an excessive amount of adhesive as if they thought sheer stubbornness could reinforce their authority. It declared my home out of compliance and listed an outrageous sum in fines, citing infractions that had either been fabricated or grossly exaggerated. The total amount? $12,000. It was laughable, a desperate, last-ditch effort to intimidate me into submission. What made it even more pathetic was the wording. Phrases like final warning and pending enforcement measures attempted to sound menacing, but I could see the cracks in their confidence. They were scrambling, panicking as they realized their grip on the community was slipping. They had relied on fear to keep people in line, and now that fear was turning against them. Ignoring the notice, I went about my day as usual, making a point to remain unfazed. But the escalation didn't stop there. Over the next 2 days, strange things began happening. My trash bins, which I had placed neatly by the curb, were suddenly missing in the morning. My mailbox, which had always been secured, was mysteriously left open, its contents scattered onto the pavement as if someone had rifled through it. My security cameras captured unfamiliar vehicles slowly circling the block, pausing just a little too long near my driveway. I wasn't an easy man to rattle, but I knew what this was, an intimidation tactic, a psychological game meant to exhaust me into compliance. They had tried legal threats, and when that failed, they had resorted to harassment. It was amateur work, sloppy and obvious. They weren't used to having to fight for control, and it showed. Then, on the third night, they made their biggest mistake yet. It was just past midnight when the motion sensors on my security system triggered an alert. I was awake instantly, instincts honed from years in law enforcement kicking in. My phone screen lit up, displaying live footage of 2 masked figures approaching my property. They weren't in HOA uniforms this time. No false pretenses, no clipboard-wielding compliance officers trying to feign authority. This was different. They were here to send a message. I moved quickly, my heart steady as I activated additional floodlights, bathing my entire front yard in harsh white light. The figures froze, caught in the open, their plan unraveling in real time. The security alarms blared, piercing through the quiet suburban night like a siren announcing their failure. The intruders hesitated, then bolted, one tripping over the curb in his rush to escape. But I had already captured everything. Their faces may have been covered, but their build, their movements, even their getaway car, it was all on camera. By the time I reviewed the footage, I already knew what needed to be done. This wasn't just an overzealous HOA board issuing fines anymore. This was criminal activity. I made the call, reporting the incident directly to my department, ensuring that this wouldn't be brushed off as a simple act of neighborhood mischief. Within minutes, patrol cars were dispatched, sweeping the area while I compiled the evidence. The footage, the tampered mailbox, the ongoing harassment, all of it pointed to a deliberate campaign of intimidation that had crossed the line into illegal retaliation. The next morning, the consequences of their actions rippled through the community. Police officers arrived at the HOA office, questioning board members and demanding records. Neighbors, now fully aware of what had been happening, began speaking up. Stories of mistreatment, of excessive fines, of threats disguised as policy enforcement came pouring out. The floodgates had been opened. What had once been an untouchable institution in the neighborhood was now under full-blown legal scrutiny. But the most satisfying moment came later that afternoon when an official cease and desist order was delivered to the HOA headquarters. A formal legal injunction, signed off by the district court, ordering an immediate halt to all enforcement actions against me pending further investigation. Their fabricated fines, their warnings, their entire charade, it was legally invalid now. The same laws they had twisted and manipulated to control residents were now being used against them. And this was only the beginning. I knew their desperation wasn't over yet. People like them never accepted defeat quietly. But what they failed to understand was that I wasn't just some homeowner fighting a petty dispute. I was law enforcement. And I wasn't going to stop until every single one of them answered for their corruption. The morning after the cease and desist order was delivered, the entire neighborhood buzzed with an energy that hadn't been there before. Whispers had turned into full-blown discussions, and the once-feared HOA was now under a microscope. Homeowners who had previously kept their heads down were emboldened, their frustrations boiling over into action. Complaints flooded city offices, some detailing years of excessive fines, threats, and even forced removals from homes under false pretenses. The very foundation of the HOA's control had cracked, and now, It was only a matter of time before it collapsed entirely. I watched from my porch as a group of homeowners gathered near the community center, their voices louder than usual, their postures no longer subdued by fear. The board members must have sensed the shift too, because for the first time since I moved in, their patrols were absent. No compliance officers circling in their cars, no aggressive notices slapped onto doors. They had gone quiet, retreating into whatever bunker they believed would shield them from the consequences barreling toward them. But silence wouldn't save them now. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. It was an investigator from the city's Fraud and Ethics Division, someone I had worked with before on corruption cases. He informed me that the reports against the HOA had uncovered something even worse than expected. Their fabricated fines, their intimidation tactics, those were just surface-level problems. The real issue? Financial fraud. The board had been inflating violation fees and siphoning off a portion of the money for personal use. It had been subtle, hidden under vague administrative costs and redirected payments, but the numbers didn't lie. They had been stealing from the very people they claimed to protect. And now, the law was coming for them. By the time the police arrived with warrants, the HOA board had already begun to fracture. Some members, realizing the walls were closing in, had quietly started resigning, hoping to distance themselves from the mess. Others, the ones who had relished their power the most, were still clinging to whatever delusions they had left, convinced they could talk their way out of it. But when the officers walked into the community center and began collecting evidence, confiscating documents, and escorting key members out in handcuffs, it became clear that this was the end of their reign. The once untouchable board was now exposed, their corruption laid bare for everyone to see. The sight of their downfall was something I would never forget. The smug expressions were gone, replaced by shock, humiliation, and, in some cases, genuine fear. HOA officer Sunglasses, the same man who had demanded to see my ID at my own home, was among those let out by law enforcement. He looked smaller now, stripped of the fake authority he had once wielded so confidently. The burly clipboard guy wasn't far behind, his head down, his bravado gone. They had spent years believing they were untouchable, but the reality of their situation was sinking in fast. As the news of their arrests spread, the neighborhood erupted into something I could only describe as relief. People who had been victims of their harassment for years finally felt free. Conversations that had once been held in hushed tones were now spoken loudly. Stories poured out. Residents who had been fined for imaginary violations, elderly homeowners forced into legal battles over nonsense regulations, families threatened with foreclosure for daring to question the board's authority. The HOA had ruled through fear, but now, that fear had turned against them. Over the next few weeks, the aftermath unfolded like a domino effect. With the board dissolved and its remaining members facing legal scrutiny, the HOA itself began to crumble. Residents banded together to dissolve the association entirely, voting to remove its control over the community. What had once been a rigid, overregulated neighborhood was now free from its grasp. The power that had been abused for so long was officially gone. No more absurd fines, no more intrusive patrols, no more fabricated authority. The nightmare was over. As for me, I stayed. I had moved into this neighborhood because I believed it could be a home, and now, it finally felt like one. No longer a place dictated by power-hungry enforcers, but a community that had stood up against corruption and won. Neighbors who had once been wary now greeted each other without hesitation, no longer worried about HOA spies lurking around the corner. The transformation was undeniable, and as I stood on my porch, watching as families gathered in their yards, children played freely, and people finally lived without fear of punishment over minor infractions, I knew one thing for certain. They had picked the wrong person to mess with. "Get off my property!" I shouted, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. The man in a crisp HOA uniform, clipboard in hand, didn't even flinch. Behind him, a small group of neighbors had gathered, whispering among themselves like vultures circling their next meal. I could feel the heat rising in my face as I clenched my fists, standing firm in the doorway of my garage. "Mr. Adams," the man began, his tone calm but dripping with condescension. "I'm afraid your property is in direct violation of several HOA regulations, and we have no choice but to act." "Violation? What violation?" I snapped, stepping forward, my voice echoing in the quiet suburban street. This is my garage, my car, my tools. Everything in here is mine, and I'm not about to let you, or anyone else, take it away from me. The HOA representative adjusted his glasses, glancing down at his clipboard as though he had all the authority in the world. According to our latest inspection, he said, not even bothering to look up, your garage contains unapproved modifications that do not align with the community's aesthetic standards. Additionally, the noise complaints regarding your vehicle have been piling up for months. We've made multiple attempts to reach a resolution with you, and since you failed to comply, the HOA board has voted to seize your garage space until further notice. My jaw dropped. Seize my garage? They couldn't possibly be serious. I took a step closer, my chest heaving as I struggled to control the rage bubbling inside me. You've got to be kidding me. You think you can just walk onto my property and take what's mine? This isn't some HOA dictatorship. At this point, my wife Rachel appeared from the house, her eyes wide with confusion. What's going on? She asked, her voice laced with worry as she looked between me and the growing crowd. I could tell she was trying to stay calm, but the tension in her shoulders gave her away. They're trying to take our garage, I said through gritted teeth. They think they can just come here and… It's not a matter of opinion, Mr. Adams, the HOA man interrupted, clearly enjoying his moment of power. You signed the agreement when you moved into this neighborhood, and those rules are legally binding. Either you vacate the garage voluntarily, or we'll be forced to escalate this matter legally. Rachel's face turned pale, and she grabbed my arm. This can't be legal, she whispered. There's no way they can do this. But the man smirked, holding up his clipboard like it was the final word on the matter. Oh, it's perfectly legal. You might want to consult a lawyer if you're having trouble understanding your obligations as a homeowner. I wanted to scream, to punch the smug look off his face, but I knew that would only make things worse. Instead, I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. Fine, I said, my voice low and steady. You want to play this game? I'll see you in court. The man's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he turned on his heel and walked away, the crowd of neighbors parting to let him through. As the group began to disperse, their whispers still hung in the air, and I could feel their judgment like a physical weight pressing down on me. Back inside the house, Rachel and I sat at the kitchen table, poring over the HOA agreement with every legal document we could find. The more we read, the angrier I became. The so-called violations they were using to justify their actions were vague at best and outright fabricated at worst. The noise complaints? Baseless. The modifications? All cosmetic and well within the rules. It was clear this wasn't about my garage. It was about control. This is insane, Rachel said, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. They can't actually get away with this, can they? They think they can, I said bitterly, slamming the stack of papers onto the table. But they've picked the wrong fight. If they want a legal battle, I'll give them one they won't forget. The next few days were a blur of frustration and preparation. I contacted a lawyer, a no-nonsense professional named Claire, who had dealt with HOA disputes before. From the moment I explained the situation, she didn't mince words. This isn't unusual, she said, her voice calm but firm. HOAs overreach all the time, banking on homeowners not wanting to go through the hassle of fighting back. But you're right to stand your ground. They don't have the legal authority to seize private property without due process. Her confidence was reassuring, but the road ahead was still daunting. Claire advised me to gather as much evidence as possible. I spent hours combing through old emails, collecting photos of the garage, and compiling every piece of correspondence I'd ever had with the HOA. Rachel even found noise level readings we'd taken for a school project with the kids, proving the sound from my car was well within acceptable limits. The HOA, of course, wasn't sitting idle. Within a week, I received an official notice from their lawyer, demanding that I relinquish access to the garage or face escalating fines. The letter was full of legal jargon, but the threat was clear. They weren't backing down. This is a scare tactic, Claire said when I showed her the letter. They're trying to make you fold before it even gets to court, but I wasn't about to fold. If anything, their arrogance only strengthened my resolve. I sent a formal response through Claire, rejecting their claims and warning them that any attempt to seize my property would be met with legal action. As the days turned into weeks, tensions in the neighborhood began to rise. The HOA had clearly been spreading their narrative, painting me as the problem. Neighbors who used to greet us warmly now avoided eye contact. I even caught one of them taking pictures of the garage from across the street, no doubt trying to build some kind of case against me. Then came the day that pushed everything over the edge. It was a sunny afternoon, and I was working on my car in the garage, trying to distract myself from the storm brewing around us. Rachel was inside with the kids, and everything seemed normal, until I heard the sound of heavy footsteps on the driveway. I turned just in time to see two men in HOA uniforms striding toward me, followed by the same clipboard-wielding man who had started this mess. "What now?" I muttered under my breath, wiping my hands on a rag as I stepped out of the garage. The man stopped just short of the doorway, his expression smug. "Mr. Adams," he said, his tone almost gleeful, "we've decided to expedite the process. You've been notified multiple times, and since you've refused to comply, we're here to take control of the garage." I stared at him, disbelief washing over me. "You're joking," I said, though his expression told me he was anything but. "This is perfectly within our rights," he said, gesturing for the two men to move past him. "We've issued the required notices, and we've documented your refusal to cooperate. Step aside, or we'll be forced to call security." The audacity of it was almost laughable. "Almost. You want to take my garage?" I said, my voice low and steady, though my hands were trembling with rage. "You go ahead and try. But I promise you, this isn't going to end the way you think it will." The two men hesitated, glancing at each other nervously, but the man with the clipboard pushed them forward. "Go on," he said. "We have the authority." Before I could react, Rachel appeared at the door, her phone in hand. "I'm recording this," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Every second of it." The clipboard man faltered, but he quickly recovered. "You can record all you want," he said. "It won't change the fact that we're acting within our legal rights." "Legal rights?" I snapped. "You're trespassing on my property. You have no authority here, and if you so much as touch anything in that garage, I'll have you arrested for theft." That gave them pause. The two men stopped in their tracks, looking uncertain as Rachel stepped closer, her phone trained on them. "This is your last warning," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "Get off my property, or I'll call the police myself." For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if realizing they'd underestimated how far I was willing to go, the clipboard man threw up his hands. "Fine," he said, his tone sharp and annoyed. "But this isn't over." "No," I said, taking a step forward, "it's not. And when it's over, you're going to wish you'd never started." The HOA's retreat that day was temporary, but it left a bitter taste in my mouth. Their threats, their arrogance, and their belief that they could steamroll me like I was some clueless homeowner. It all burned deep. I knew they were regrouping, planning their next move. They had underestimated me once, but I wasn't going to let it happen again. Claire, my lawyer, wasn't surprised when I called her to recount what had happened. "This is classic overreach," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "They're testing how far they can push you before you break. But we've got them cornered. If they escalate, it's going to backfire spectacularly." Her confidence was reassuring, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered. The next morning, it became clear why. A certified letter arrived, bearing the HOA's logo. Inside was a formal notice of legal action. They were suing me, claiming I was in violation of multiple clauses in the HOA agreement. The demands were absurd. They wanted full control of the garage space until I made appropriate modifications and agreed to pay a series of fines. The total amount? Over $20,000. Rachel stared at the letter in disbelief. "This is insane," she said, her voice shaking. "They can't actually think they'll win, can they?" "They don't care about winning," I said bitterly. "This is about making my life miserable until I give up." But giving up wasn't an option. That afternoon, Claire and I filed a counterclaim. Not only did we deny their allegations, but we accused the HOA of harassment, trespassing, and abuse of power. Claire was thorough, citing every law and precedent that proved their actions were not only unethical but illegal. If they wanted a fight, I was going to make sure it was one they wouldn't forget. The first court hearing was set for the following week. It felt like the entire neighborhood knew about it, too. The whispers and sideways glances grew more frequent, and the tension was palpable. Even the kids at the bus stop seemed to sense something was wrong. The day of the hearing, Rachel and I arrived early, my stomach churning with nerves. Claire, however, was as calm as ever. "Remember," she said as we waited for the judge to take the bench, "the burden of proof is on them. All we have to do is show that their claims are baseless, which they are." The HOA's lawyer, a stiff, overly formal man who seemed to thrive on technicalities, opened with a long-winded argument about how I had violated the HOA's sacred bylaws. He pointed to vague clauses about community harmony and aesthetic consistency, claiming that my garage, my car, and even my refusal to comply were disruptive to the neighborhood. When it was Claire's turn, she didn't hold back. She started by dismantling their evidence piece by piece. The noise complaints? Baseless hearsay with no actual documentation. The so-called modifications? Perfectly legal and well within the guidelines. The fines? Arbitrary and excessive. But it was when she brought up the trespassing incident that things really started to shift. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm and clear, "the HOA's representatives entered my client's property without permission, attempted to seize his belongings, and issued threats that have no legal foundation. These actions go beyond a simple disagreement over bylaws. They constitute harassment and a blatant abuse of authority." The judge, a middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze, leaned forward slightly, her interest clearly piqued. "Do you have evidence of this alleged trespassing?" Claire smiled. "We do, Your Honor. My client's wife recorded the entire incident on her phone." Rachel handed over the footage, and the judge watched in silence as the video played. The moment the HOA representatives were shown stepping into the garage uninvited, the judge's expression hardened. "This is highly concerning," she said, her tone clipped. "HOA bylaws do not grant you the authority to seize private property. I'll need to review this further, but for now, I'm inclined to place an injunction preventing the HOA from taking any further action against Mr. Adams until this matter is resolved." The HOA's lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a sharp look. "Your client's behavior is bordering on predatory," she said firmly. "If this continues, they may find themselves facing serious legal consequences." As we left the courtroom, Rachel squeezed my hand, her relief evident. "We're winning, aren't we?" she whispered. "We're not done yet," I said, though I couldn't deny the small flicker of hope growing inside me. The tide was starting to turn. The injunction against the HOA was a small victory, but it felt like a monumental shift. For the first time, they were on the defensive. Claire advised me to stay vigilant, warning that organizations like this often tried underhanded tactics when their authority was challenged. Her words proved prophetic. A few days later, I noticed something strange. Flyers began appearing in mailboxes across the neighborhood, including ours. They were printed on glossy paper with the HOA's logo and a headline that read, "Protect our community standards, stop neighborhood violations." Beneath it was a not-so-subtle jab at me, describing an unnamed homeowner who was repeatedly disrupting the peace and ignoring HOA regulations. Rachel read the flyer and shook her head in disbelief. "This is just desperate," she said. "They're trying to turn the entire neighborhood against us." It seemed to be working. Neighbors who used to smile and wave now crossed the street when they saw us. A few even posted in the community Facebook group, parroting the HOA's claims. One comment stuck out: "If he didn't have anything to hide, he wouldn't be fighting so hard." I clenched my fists as I read it, anger simmering beneath the surface. The HOA wasn't just fighting me in court, they were trying to ruin my reputation. Claire, however, saw an opportunity. "This is good," she said when I showed her the flyer. "It's evidence. If they're spreading misinformation to damage your character, we can use that against them." But the flyers weren't the only problem. Late one evening, as I was locking up the garage, I noticed a figure lingering near the edge of my driveway. It was one of the HOA board members, a wiry man with a clipboard who had been present during the earlier confrontation. He was standing just out of reach of the security lights, scribbling something down. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice cutting through the still night air. He flinched but didn't move. "Just doing a routine inspection," he said, his tone smug. "On my property?" I snapped, stepping closer. "Get out of here before I call the police." He hesitated for a moment, then turned and walked away, but not before shooting me a parting smirk. The interaction left me seething. It was clear the HOA wasn't going to back down without a fight. The next morning, I installed additional security cameras, making sure every angle of the property was covered. Rachel thought I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. I was right. A week later, as we were sitting down to dinner, a loud banging shook the front door. I opened it to find two uniformed officers standing on the porch. Behind them was the same wiry HOA board member, looking smug as ever. "Mr. Adams," one of the officers began, "we've received a report of unpermitted construction on your property." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "Construction? What construction?" "The report states you've been making significant modifications to your garage without approval," the officer continued. "We'll need to inspect the premises." For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. Then the realization hit me. This was another ploy, another baseless accusation meant to harass and intimidate me. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the garage. "Go ahead," I said, my voice tight with anger. "You're not going to find anything." The officers conducted their inspection, poking around the garage and taking notes, while the HOA board member lingered outside, looking far too pleased with himself. When the officers finally finished, one of them approached me with an apologetic expression. "Everything checks out," he said. "There's no construction here. Sorry for the inconvenience." "Inconvenience?" I repeated, my voice rising. "This is harassment. He's been stalking my property and filing false reports. What are you going to do about that?" The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "There's not much we can do unless you want to file a formal complaint," he said. "But I'd recommend keeping documentation of everything." As the officers left, the HOA board member shot me one last smug look before sauntering away. Rachel put a hand on my arm, her face pale. "This is getting out of control," she said. "I know," I replied, my jaw clenched, "but they just gave us more ammunition." The next day, Claire filed a new motion in court, accusing the HOA of harassment and filing false reports. She attached the police record from the bogus inspection, along with the security footage of the board member loitering near my driveway. "This should make them think twice before pulling another stunt," she said confidently. As the court date approached, the tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. The HOA smear campaign was in full swing, but I refused to let it break me. They wanted a fight? I was ready to give them one. The court hearing finally arrived, and I walked into the courthouse with Claire by my side, carrying a folder stuffed with evidence. Rachel sat in the gallery behind me, her presence a silent reassurance. The HOA's legal team was already seated, looking as smug as ever. Their lead attorney, the same stiff man from the last hearing, seemed confident as he arranged his papers. As proceedings began, the judge wasted no time. She addressed the HOA's attorney first, her tone sharp. "Your client has been accused of harassment, trespassing, and filing false complaints. I expect clear evidence to refute these allegations." The HOA attorney rose, trying his best to maintain an air of authority. He reiterated their claims about my violations, presenting photos of my garage and a list of noise complaints from anonymous neighbors. It was the same weak argument they'd been relying on since the beginning, and Claire was ready. When it was her turn to speak, she dismantled their case with precision. She started by pointing out the lack of concrete evidence. "Your Honor, the photos they've submitted show nothing more than a well-maintained garage. There are no unapproved modifications, no construction, and no violations of the HOA's bylaws." She then moved on to the noise complaints. "These complaints are anonymous and unverifiable. Furthermore, my client has provided noise level readings taken from his property, which prove that his vehicle complies with local ordinances." The judge nodded, clearly unimpressed with the HOA's arguments. But Claire wasn't finished. "Your Honor, we've also documented a pattern of harassment by the HOA." she continued, her voice steady and firm. This includes trespassing on my client's property, filing false complaints with law enforcement, and distributing defamatory flyers throughout the neighborhood. She handed over the police report from the bogus inspection, as well as the security footage of the HOA board member lingering near my driveway. These actions go beyond a simple misunderstanding. They represent a coordinated effort to intimidate and harass my client. The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Does the defense have a response to these allegations?" she asked, turning to the HOA's attorney. He stood, clearly flustered. "Your Honor, the HOA was simply acting in the best interests of the community. We had reason to believe the plaintiff's actions were disruptive and in violation of the bylaws." And yet, the judge said, her tone icy, "You've provided no substantial evidence to support those claims. Meanwhile, the plaintiff has presented a compelling case that your client has overstepped its authority in multiple ways." The HOA attorney stammered, but it was clear the tide had turned. The judge turned to me and Claire. "I find the actions of the HOA to be deeply troubling," she said. "Their behavior appears to be not only unwarranted but deliberately punitive. I am issuing a ruling in favor of the plaintiff." Rachel let out a quiet gasp of relief behind me, and I could feel the tension in my shoulders start to melt away. But the judge wasn't done. In addition to dismissing the HOA's claims, I am granting the plaintiff's request for damages. The HOA will pay restitution for the legal fees incurred by Mr. Adams, as well as a penalty for harassment. Furthermore, I am issuing a formal warning to the HOA. Any further attempts to interfere with Mr. Adams's property will result in legal consequences. The gavel came down, and just like that, it was over. As we left the courtroom, Rachel threw her arms around me, her relief palpable. "We did it," she whispered. "It's finally over." But the real victory came later that evening. As word of the ruling spread, the neighbors who had once avoided us began to shift. A few even knocked on our door, offering quiet apologies for siding with the HOA. It turned out we weren't the only ones who had been targeted. My victory had given them the courage to speak out, and soon the HOA found itself under fire from multiple directions. Within weeks, the board president resigned, and new leadership was elected. The new HOA was far less aggressive, focusing on fostering a sense of community rather than enforcing draconian rules. For the first time in months, Rachel and I felt like we could finally breathe. That night, as I stood in my garage, tinkering with my car, I thought about everything we'd been through. The stress, the anger, the endless battles. It had all been worth it. I'd stood my ground, not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever been bullied by a system that thought it was untouchable. As the engine roared to life, I couldn't help but smile. This was my garage, my car, my home, and no one was ever going to take that away from me again.